Delighted to say that Don McRae joins us now. Don, The Last Bell is your fifth book about boxing, and I was reading recently in your piece in The Guardian, your last, and I suppose I was wondering whether any of that sentiment has to do with the natural release that comes with getting such a deeply personal project off your desk, or whether it's just simply a case that boxing has now become too unscrupulous to devote that kind of time and energy to again.
It's a good question, Connor, because there's always like a deluge of emotion when you get to the end of a book, especially like this one that took me almost 6 years to write. But no, I don't think there was too much emotion involved when I wrote in The Guardian that I think this will be my last book on boxing. I think I need to make a distinction between boxing and the business of boxing. I still love boxing, love talking to the fighters, love going to great fights, but the business has just got darker than ever. And I do think now, certainly the long form book, I don't particularly think I'll be writing about boxing again.
Okay. The decision to make it partly autobiographical, did you know that at the outset, or did that sort of generally happen as you kind of dived into what you wanted to get off your chest?
I think I had an idea that I wanted to write personally because a lot of my sort of other books about boxing and other subjects have been from a historical perspective, where obviously I'm not involved and I attempt to tell the story from a detached perspective. But this one, I wanted to do a book where I was actually close to the heart of boxing and that I was with the fighters before fights and afterwards. And I felt it would give it an immediacy if I explained how I personally was feeling watching them. And at the same time, there were a number of events in my personal life. I lost my sister, my mother, and my father in the space of about 22 months. And I just hope it's not too self-indulgent or sentimental, but it just felt instinctive to me to sort of write about those deaths as I was moving deeper and deeper into the darkness of boxing.
Yeah, sure. There's a very, you outlined that the stimulus of the book initially is a conversation with your late sister Heather about the Tyson Fury fight
Yes.
with Deontay Wilder. But I was struck as I went on in the book about not long after you received a phone call about your father dying, that the first thing you did was switch on, and there was no boxing match, but there was an MMA fight, and you sort of lost yourself very briefly in that combat. So it's obviously deep rooted inside you to give yourself a distraction or something from boxing or even combat sports more
Of
broadly.
course. It was kind of a bizarre moment. Obviously I was kind of deeply, even though I knew my father was so severely ill, he was in South Africa. It was sort of towards the end of COVID. I couldn't go see him. I couldn't fly out. So it was kind of a surreal time and obviously devastating to hear your father has died, even though he lived to a good age. And this follows the death of my sister and my mother. And so, I wandered sort of downstairs and I knew that there was this UFC fight between this woman, Rose Namajunas, who I don't know much about UFC, but she's the fighter I've always wanted to interview and I'm interested in her. And I kind of had a private conversation with my dad. And I said to my dad, I'm sure you don't mind, do you? I'm just going to watch this. And I have this habit of making things personal. And it felt so important that she won this fight. And she did. And in a way, I just felt, kind of a totally nonsense, but I kind of felt she won it for my dad. This is my kind of weird obsession with boxing. And in that case, it was a UFC fight.
Yeah, the first chapter about Tyson Fury, he's a very interesting figure, I think, for a lot of us because he presents the moral quandary of boxing, maybe in microcosm. Like on the one hand, you interviewed him at a point when he was very, very vulnerable and he was very depressed. And he is quite a charismatic person. But on the other hand, there were the homophobic rants and then the link to Daniel Kinahan and at one stage a failed drugs test, albeit that was overturned on appeal. And I think like a lot of us, we kind of question our affiliations because of those reasons, but ultimately we find it very hard not to watch them when they're in the ring.
Yeah, he is a highly complex man, but he's also can be a magnetic personality. He's capable of saying some deeply moving and almost poetic things sometimes. Certainly, my first interview with him in 2011, where he opened up for the first time about his mental health. He didn't know that he had bipolar disorder then. was a moving interview. But in subsequent interviews, he could say some deeply offensive things, whether it was homophobic comments. And as you said, the drugs test certainly left a stain on his reputation, even though he seemed to be subsequently cleared. And I kind of lost interest in him to a certain extent in about sort of 2014 to about 2018, because although he won the world title, he was saying a lot of crazy things that I just didn't agree with. And then he spiraled out of control and ballooned up in weight to almost 400 pounds. He was close to being an alcoholic, he told me in subsequent years. His drug intake was huge. But then he kind of pulled me back into it because he showed a lot of fortitude to come back. And yeah, in 2018, when he fought Deontay Wilder, I was back in the boxing business, watching him so closely.
Yeah, like ultimately, I suppose that's what it comes down to for a lot of us, that we realize that the business of boxing behind it can be very off-putting. But what happens in the ring is essentially the same thing that's been happening for the last 100 years.
Exactly. And I guess the boxing business, let's face it, for that same length of time has also always been corrupt. If you think back to US boxing, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, the mob were in charge of boxing in the United States. It's always been a dirty business. But it's also been full of courage and skill and these amazing characters who have these compelling stories. But for me personally, I did feel, this book covers the years 2018 to 2024, and I felt that the darkness just intensified. There was wave after wave of bad things happening in the business of boxing.
Yeah, you dedicate the book to the family of and friends of Pat Day, who lost his life as a result of injuries in the ring. And in Ireland, we certainly had echoes of that recently with John Cooney. What was it about Pat Day's story that you found sort of so compelling, and the need to write about it?
In 2019, in the space of 4 months, five professional fighters lost their lives within hours or days of a fight in the ring. And of these five, Pat Day was the most unusual. He was the one I knew the most about. The others, I must be honest, three of them I'd never heard of before. But Pat was the one of the five who I knew a little bit about. He was a good fighter. And I knew he'd been to college. And I thought, he was a good looking guy, he was charismatic, eloquent, obviously intelligent. Why is he boxing? Because most fighters box because they have no other choice. So within 6 weeks of his death, flew to New York City and went out to Long Island to meet friends and family of his, because I just wanted to know what was it about Pat that made him want to box. And the answer is so hard to find, but there's one line that sort of stayed with me. The family members said they were out in Haiti, where the family originally were from, and Pat Day's uncle said to him, "Pat, if I give you $1 million, would you stop boxing?" And Pat said, "No. If you give me $20 million, I will still continue to fight because that's who I am." And yeah, here was this guy, could have done so much else in life, but his tragedy was that he loved boxing, which clearly, ended up taking his life.
Yeah, it's there's a part in the book too where you speak about Deontay Wilder and his ferocious punching before the first Fury fight, but he spoke openly about sort of taking a life, and like whether it was bluster or bombast, the fact of the matter is it's still a distinct possibility, and it does hang over every major fight like that.
And he said it in such a chilling way. He said, "I want to have a body on my record."
Yeah.
Record being you've had 32 fights, you've won all 32. And in his case, he would have won 31 of the 32 by knockout. But he was saying, "I want a body." And yes, of course, it's full of bluster and braggadocio and the nonsense of boxing. I don't genuinely believe that he wanted to, harm anyone to that extent. But it summed up how naked and stark the business of boxing is. And, it seems to happen whenever I go to a fight. I often go pick up my media credential, I go to the back of the building, and you always see the ambulances waiting. And it's kind of sobers you because you know that these ambulances are on guard, and they will be taking a fighter who possibly could be end up in a coma or even worse.
Yeah, because even in the case of John Cooney, I spoke to people from the British border boxing border control, and
Yeah,
he underwent every safety procedure. He passed every MRI scan. But
yeah,
like you said, like he was in a hospital in Belfast within 15 minutes of leaving the ring, partly
yeah.
because there was an ambulance waiting for him. We all, I think, and I think you outlined it really well in the book, how we all have to somehow not necessarily make peace, but just accept that that danger hangs over boxing when we do watch it.
I feel such a hypocrite because, I wrote a book called Dark Trade in 1996. Shows how long ago it was, almost 30 years. And that book, as the title suggests, it is about, the dark side of boxing. And there is death in that book. And, I'm close to a fighter like Michael Watson, who ends up in a wheelchair. I followed another fighter, Gerald McLennan, who fights Nigel Benn. He ends up blind, partially paralyzed and permanently brain damaged. And yet here I am continuing. And in this book, The Last Bell, fighters do lose their lives. Um, and yeah, I've come to kind of accept my hypocrisy, but doesn't make me feel comfortable. And I kind of still feel kind of ashamed by it that I'm still following boxing closely because, look what it does.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the responses or the riposte or the defenses to boxing is
Mm.
outlined in the case of Isaac Chamberlain, who
Yes.
was going down a very potentially ruinous road with regard to what he was, he'd been involved in sort of small time drug taking and was in a pretty bad spiral until boxing effectively saved him. And like, how do you, how do you, weigh up the kind of the pros and cons in that situation, because there's clearly a case of a young person whose life was changed for the better because of the sport.
And that's what hopefully the book conveys, that actually I still believe boxing does more good than harm. And there's a lot of light and a lot of hope in boxing. And Isaac is a classic example. At the age of 11 in South London, he was a shy little boy. His father had abandoned the family. His mother had him when she was 17 years old. So she was 28 then, and he's 11. And he's lost, and he gets kind of co opted into a gang. And his job is to deliver crack and cocaine on his bicycle. His life is going nowhere but to a bad, bad place. His mother then heard that if she took him, excuse me, apologies, Connor, hold on.
That's okay, that.
That was the cough I warned you about. Just give me a moment. Can I just sort of pick up from where we kind of left off, I think?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. His mother was obviously anxious about Isaac's future, and someone advised her, take your son to a boxing gym. She knew nothing about boxing, but she followed the advice, took him to the local gym in Brixton. Isaac walked in, and he said to me later, Don, I couldn't believe it. It was mayhem. These guys were punching each other. It looked so exciting. It looked crazy. But the thing, Connor, that resonated with him most was that the older men, the trainers, the coaches, were actually imparting encouragement. They were saying to the kids, well done. That's looking good. You can do better. And Isaac craved that because he had no validation in his own life. So that positive aspect of boxing appealed to him. And of course, then there was the discipline and the ambition was instilled into him. So it can do marvelous things and save people. It's a cliche, oh, boxing saves lives, but it generally does. But the antithesis of that is that, yes, boxing can also take your life.
Yeah, another thing that I think you convey really well in the book is how a young fighter's career and potentially their lives can be changed by an unexpected defeat. They can be dropped by a promoter, by a trainer.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you're the B fighter. You're fighting for very little money in fights you're expected to lose. Given the very sort of cutthroat nature of boxing at that level, like, are you surprised by the corruptibility of it?
No, I'm certainly not surprised by it. It is a dirty business. And, just on that B side point you made, that happened to Pat Day. His first, I think, 11 or 12 fights he won. He was definitely an A side fighter, going high, but then lost. And once your unbeaten record is besmirched in boxing, suddenly you no longer the guy they want to back, and you then get moved onto the B side. And Pac fought 5 A side fighters, beat them all, but he was taking damage. That was the accumulation of the damage. And at the same time, we have this constant corruption of people wanting to make money out of boxing and make money out of fighters. And so I'm not surprised that it's so susceptible to corruption.
Yeah. Are you? I don't know whether you kind of feel this, and I know you spent a lot of time very close to fighters in dressing rooms afterwards and in gyms.
Yeah.
But the question of performance enhancing drugs and boxing, like very few fighters speak out about it,
Yes.
and they don't air their suspicions very much. And usually, history tells us that that's not a great sign in a sport.
Yes.
Have you encountered any, even just attitudes towards the issue of performance enhancing drugs and the usage of
Yes.
from your time with fighters? Because clearly the incentive exists.
You know, I would say ballpark figures about 10 fighters, professional fighters, have told me that um, boxing is just happening all over the business. One fighter in particular went on the record with me, and he's a world champion called Regis Prograis from the United States. And he told me that, boxing is, doping is so prevalent in boxing that he believed, of course, he didn't have hard and fast evidence, but with his own eyes and experiences, he thought up to 70% of professional fighters were doping in some form.
Wow.
And I put that to other fighters. Oh, Regis said this. And they said, of course. But they don't want to say it online. But he was willing to come out. And, I was with him in Los Angeles. I think it was 2023. He was about to fight for the world title, the WBC world title. And he was saying to me, I've not been tested once. This camp has been going on for nearly 10 weeks. I've not been tested once. My opponent hasn't been tested once. Where are they? Where are the testers? And, it was crazy that a fighter was actually asking to be tested because there was just no testing. So, yeah, that was one of the things that also made me think I've got to get out of this business in terms of book writing because it's so dirty with doping.
Yeah, it's I suppose when you can't believe what you're seeing with your eyes, it can be very
Yeah,
difficult to get a
of
full
course.
appreciation for it.
Absolutely. And the moment, the watershed moment for me, I think, was in October 2022. Conor Ben is going
Mm.
to fight Chris Eubank Jr. And, the build up to that fight, I didn't buy into. I thought it was a manufactured bout built on the legacy of their fathers. But I interviewed Conor Ben about a week before the fight. And it was his last big interview. And was tough to get him to open up, but eventually he did, and he shed a lot of tears in that interview and opened up about his childhood. And, it was quite a moving interview. I came away thinking, wow, what an interview. I'm kind of hooked. I want to see what happens between Eubank and Ben. My interview was published the following Monday. And then the next day, I was just checking my phone and I suddenly saw Conor Ben test positive. And of course, I swore because I've been duped again by boxing. But then I started thinking, well, actually, this is good. If a fighter has, you know, performance enhancing drugs in his system, it's a good thing. It's been exposed. This is actually a good day for boxing. But suddenly, my sort of equanimity turned to anger because as the day wore on, I began to understand that Eddie Hearn, his promoter, and Conor Ben and others involved in the promotion, the TV companies, were all finding ways to keep the fight on. And I just couldn't believe it because the Ben family, the Eubank family, and the Hearn family had all been scarred by boxing tragedy. And that was the moment where I also again thought this is just too much. And at that stage, we didn't know that there were two positive drugs tests for Conor Ben.
Yeah, not to kind of move quickly on from that subject, but it was interesting to read about Daniel Kinahan from a different perspective because
Yeah,
obviously on a very base level, this is a very Irish story. But I think in this part of the world, maybe we didn't fully understand quite how influential he was in boxing, because we automatically assumed that as a sort of a crime land figure as he became, that there was only a certain level you could get up to in, sports administration. Whereas I think maybe with the rest of the world, there was almost an ambivalence towards his crime background because he had become such an influential figure within boxing. But it felt like those two worlds collided when Tyson Fury put up that video
Yeah.
announcing the fight deal with Anthony Joshua, and actually naming Daniel Kinahan in that. How did you see that play out? Were you as aware of Kinahan's crime background, or did you encounter him first as a boxing figure?
By the time of that video, I was certainly aware, and I was again ashamed that the UK, where I write, we had done nothing on Kinahan, whereas the writers in Ireland and other media outlets in Ireland had been so good in actually, exposing Kinahan and talking about the criminal past. But once that video sort of happened, suddenly I think the world woke up. Oh wow, this is this guy. But yes, it took a long time for me to wake up to the significance of it. But that moment clearly changed things. And yes, there's that ambivalence. I would talk to fighters who would, off the record, tell me, yes, they had dealt with Kinahan before. And they would say things to me like, oh, I've never been paid more money. I've never been paid on time like I am with the Kinahans. And I've never had calls from, I assume, from Daniel Kinahan himself supporting me. So they were saying, oh, this is guy's a force for good. And I would say, yes, but where, his billion-pound empire, what is that built on? Oh, we don't know about that. That's not our business. So, and I'm not there to judge the fighters. They're in a hard business, as we've said, it cost their lives. But they certainly, took the money because, it was coming and it was coming on time.
Yeah, it's the same point I think about, Saudi Arabia and the influx of, I suppose, cash from the Middle East. And we're
Yes.
probably at the point where most people understand the motivations for states to flood. But by the same token, we want to see the best, no more than the Newcastle United supporters at the weekend were desperate for a
Of
trophy.
course. Of course.
The overriding or the overwhelming sense of we want to see the best fights take place, it still, I think, holds sway over, our reservations over human rights abuses or anything else as a general populace.
It does. And, I hear so many people, and I understand the sentiment that, oh, boxing in a way has never been as good as it has been over the last 18 months because we are seeing these amazing fights and these cards that are stacked with fairly closely contested matchups. Um, I sometimes am guilty of that too, but also, when I've been in Saudi Arabia, I've been 3 times. I've spoken to dissidents. I've spoken to people who have family members who are awaiting execution or have been detained for many, many years for the crime, in inverted commas, of posting some fairly innocuous criticism of the state. And to know that a woman can be locked up in jail because she wore dungarees and posted on Snapchat and called for more liberty for women and to be locked up for 11 or 12 years. Those stories were uppermost in my mind, and the excitement of the boxing fan in me was quelled by the gravity of what is happening to so many people in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, having been there on the ground, like, where do you think that is going next? Like, are we going to get to the stage where Saudi Arabia, like, I know effectively they now own sort of big ticket boxing, but
Yeah.
what's their next move here?
Well, yeah, they seem to have played their next card, and that's Turkey Al Sheikh talking to Dana White of the UFC and the WWE guy, and there's this new company that is going to, in their words, crush all opposition. I don't know how this is going to work. They're talking about a boxing league, but I don't know how it will affect beyond the top tier, the elite fighters. What about the people in the middle tiers and the lower down? I have no idea. What about women boxers? You know, I don't see these guys ever talking about Katie Taylor or Amanda Serrano, who are incredible fighters. Clarissa Shields, what a boxer. But there's no appetite, it seems, on the side of the Saudis to feature women's boxing. So all these things, just leave me with a lot of concern.
Yeah, like you kind of document as you're going on how the access has changed to the top fighters. It has
Yes.
traditionally, boxing has been the one remaining sport where access was mutually appreciated, if you want to put it that way. But that has changed now.
It has. Some of the old school journalists, like people like Hugh McIlvanney, who was perhaps the greatest boxing writer of them all, who died a few years ago, he would be able to, with other journalists, they'd go to the States, they'd pick up the phone and phone Muhammad Ali at home and say, Champ, can we come see you? And Ali would entertain them for the whole afternoon. Those days, of course, have gone. But like certainly in dark trade times in the 1990s, and even when I started this book, The Last Bell in 2018, I felt I could go almost anywhere in the world and get access to a fighter. But over the last couple of years, it has become more and more difficult. And I haven't had a one-to-one interview with a top tier fighter for some time. What you get offered is sort of what they call roundtables, which are like 10, 15, 20 minutes with 4 or 5 of you and being quite pleased on often occasions. And I heard at the last big bill in Saudi, even those had been dispensed with. So access is becoming harder, which is, for me, in a sporting sphere, a small tragedy because, as you say, boxing was the most open of all sports in terms of talking to elite performers, and now it's becoming like professional football in England. It's so hard to get access.
Yeah, I suppose the other advancement recently, if you want to put it like that, in the broadcasting or the hosting of boxing, is Netflix incursion into the market.
Sure.
I know from
Yeah.
talking to a couple of journalists who were in Dallas for the Tyson Mike Tyson.
Yeah, I was there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like a very shall we say unproductive press arrangement.
They just didn't seem to care or understand, and nothing was done. But I guess it's Netflix, so they have so much money they could just bulldoze and attempt to find out how they would do it. But it was a bit of an amateur shit show, excuse my language. And I think Netflix is the one unknown factor. Obviously, they're doing Katie Taylor, Amanda Serrano again this summer at Madison Square Gardens. If Netflix become genuinely interested in boxing, there would be scope to have an alternative to the Saudi sort of UFC link. But yeah, certainly for us humble scribblers, it doesn't bode too well because I don't think they were too bothered by us at all.
Yeah, the Katie Taylor, like the chapter that you have on Katie Taylor is called The Lonely Passion of Katie Taylor. And I think that will resonate with most people over here who've watched her since, the days of winning at the London Olympics. There's a quote in the book from an interview that you did with Katie in December 2021 when she acknowledged she can't do this forever. And here we are 4 years later, and she's going into another huge fight this summer. She'll be 39 in July, the same month that she fights Amanda Serrano in Madison Square Gardens. In as much of a sort of a almost cultural icon as Katie is now, and while a lot of people would say that, fighters boxing past their peak can sometimes besmirch their legacy, when you're putting on shows like this and when you're making the sort of money that Katie Taylor has made from her last couple of fights, it's almost impossible to make an argument against continuing to box.
Of course. I mean, the money is huge. And if anyone in boxing deserves to be paid those kind of figures, I think it's Katie Taylor. She's been a pioneer. She has, changed the landscape of boxing, for women and for girls. She deserves each dollar that she makes. But yes, the damage, I get concerned because she has been in so many wars over the years. Even if you think back to her amateur days, she was a dominant, Olympic champion, of course, but she had some hard fights. And professionally, there have been many, I would say, on one hand, you could count 4 or 5 damaging fights. And I've attempted to explore with her what she 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 does after boxing, and she acknowledges to me of the danger. She says she trusts the people close to her to tell her if there are any signs. She says the fact she doesn't spar so much sort of is an important factor in protecting her brain. But I hope, and I think there are people close to Katie, who, you know, also feel that the time is coming soon. And, I would love this to be her last fight. I'd love her to win and then, get out of boxing. But
Sure.
it's not not my place to tell her that, of course.
Sure. Like, how did you find Katie when you spoke to her? There's definitely a touch of the introvert there. I know, reading some quotes from
Definitely.
the last couple of fights, that the most grueling part of the week for Katie seemed to be talking about the fight in advance. That seems to be very much kind of part of the persona she's grown into.
She generally dislikes it. As affable and polite as she is, she doesn't like being interviewed. I think she's okay with me because I know her quite well, and she's okay with sort of journalists from Ireland who she's known for a long time. But on the whole, she just is so uncomfortable with it. And Connor, I think I had this ambition. Oh, I was going to pull back the veil from Katie Taylor and get to the heart of Katie as a woman, beyond as a fighter. But, clearly that wasn't going to happen. And I came to sort of so respect her privacy and also think, well, her boxing career tells such a story that, we don't need to hound her for details about her own life. It's up to her what she wants to divulge. And I just kind of respected her her quietness. And I forget the quote she gave me, but it was along the lines of that, quietness matters. And you can say a lot with silence and stillness and calm. And for all the fury she shows with her fists, that sense of calm in her also says a lot about her in this crazy, chaotic world of boxing.
Sure. If we could just return for a second to the personal story contained within the book,
Sure.
one of the more dramatic, or one of the more remarkable things that people will learn is that your father, he was sort of pioneered bringing electricity to a lot of townships in apartheid
Yes.
South Africa. Um,
Yes.
I don't know whether that gave you even more comfort after he died, the fact that he has this legacy, or were we always just used to that when you became aware of it?
Um, it certainly gave me comfort, not only on his death, but in the last year of his life when I knew death was coming. It gave me huge comfort because he'd been a significant man. He'd had a full, wonderful life, and it helped so many people. But at the risk of going into excessive detail here, but I'll try to keep it short. Just sort of what my father did. When I was a little boy, my father was kind of accepting of apartheid. He was always kind and compassionate, always taught me that Black people should be treated with dignity and respect. But he didn't actually complain much about apartheid. And we had some wonderful Black men and women who worked in our house who we were close to. But I never forgot as a little boy, I would make a cup of coffee for them and I had to use their tin mug because that was the mug for the girl, in inverted commas, and the boy, in inverted commas. These were middle aged men who loved me and I loved them. But that's how white South Africa was. So my father came from that. And then by the time I'm in my early 20s, I have to get out of South Africa for political reasons, but I'm working in Soweto, the Black Township. And I would come home full of fire and just being a snotty young person, thinking I knew it all, castigating my father, saying, "You don't know in Soweto there's hardly any electricity," and, just going all guns blazing at my dad. It was only years later that I subsequently found out that my dad was going into the township at night. He was the chief executive of the state electricity company, and he was meeting members of Nelson Mandela's banned African National Congress. Not only would he have lost his job immediately, he would have been locked up in jail if he had been caught by the police. So he did something hugely significant. But a bit like Katie, he didn't speak a lot about it, certainly not publicly. But then as I got older, he told me the whole story. And of course, that we were so close anyway, but our closeness intensified once I sort of understood what he had done.
Yeah, the chapter that deals with his death is I suppose the background, the context to it is the lockdown, COVID, which
Yes.
which felt very strange to read about because I think for a lot of us, not that we've forgotten about it, but we've deliberately tried to shunt that, and
Yes.
and outlining it, like, and not to give every detail away, but like you couldn't attend your own father's funeral because of that. Do you have a deeper resentment for everything that the world went through in that time than maybe most of the rest of us might?
I don't, in a way, because like when I think back to COVID, sometimes I just only think, oh, the weather was amazing that first summer, and I don't know. I think was it quite good in Ireland too, the first few months of COVID.
Yeah, it was for a
Certainly,
bit, yeah.
yeah, and that's what I kind of think about, and that my kids came home, and my wife and three kids and I were together. But yes, of course, what was happening is that my father was dying and I couldn't fly to South Africa. Luckily, I'd been to see him about 6 weeks before COVID started, so I had seen him. But when he died, I couldn't go to the service. But in a way, kind of weirdly, it was this one of the most kind of beautiful, unforgettable days of my life because again, it was a I suppose we allow the weather to influence sometimes, but it was like a sun-kissed day where I live in England. It was always like being back in South Africa. And while we could only log on to the service, I'd written a eulogy which the minister in the church read. He delivered a beautiful eulogy, and it just was such a moving day. And I just felt kind of accepting of it all, and I think it just helped that, yeah, he'd lived to such a good age and he'd done so many good things, and the same with my mother. So I could be quite accepting. But yeah, even while I was writing it, I was thinking, God, this is only 5 years ago, but how weird it was with the masks and the lockdown and the social distancing, crazy times.
Mm. So, do you think you'll go back to Saudi Arabia for another fight? I know that your credentials are under surveillance, or that you might not get them back.
Well, I don't, I've always, whenever I've applied, I've got credentials, but the last visit, which was in December of last year, that was the only time I felt a little unnerved because I got to the airport and at immigration control, the woman stamped my passport, but then she held on to it and started looking at her computer, looking at me back at the computer, and eventually gestured to me to follow her. And I was taken to an office, and I ended up waiting for about 40 minutes, which was all a bit disquieting because the men in the office held my passport, were clearly talking about me in Arabic on the phone to other people. But finally, they took me back to immigration control. She stamped my passport, and I said to the man, "What's up? Have there any problems?" He just said, "Go." So I don't know what it was about, whether it was an admin thing or anything else, but no harm was done to me. But yeah, it made me feel a little uncomfortable. Subsequent, I've written about Saudi a lot, and I know I have not pleased people involved in boxing and in Saudi Arabia with my articles. Since the book's publication, I've spoken about it, even more openly. So I don't know whether I will get credentials next time. And to be honest, I don't know whether I want to go back, but part of me feels I need to go back and I hopefully write about the boxing and also write because I do see positive changes in Saudi too. In the 3 visits I've been, there was a stage where music was banned in elevators because it was seen as a degrading Western influence. Now you can get the same shite elevator music in Saudi that you'll get anywhere in the world. Women can now drive, which they couldn't do sort of 7, 8 years ago. There are changes coming, but yeah, I have obviously ambivalence about going back.
Yeah, there's obviously a body of opinion there to say that, say, a fight like Fury Usyk,
Mm,
you know, lacked the same resonance because it wasn't somewhere like Madison Square Garden or in Las Vegas.
yeah,
But then also there's another body of opinion that says we might have seen Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao fight in their prime had
of
Saudi
course.
Arabia been around at the time. Like there is a bit of kind of Western snobbery about it too. Sort of,
There is.
that's undeniable around the kind of whole perception of the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, particularly when it comes to hosting sport.
Yeah, and the accusation has been made of me that, oh, you're such a Western privileged person, and you're so jaundiced and cynical towards the Middle East, and is there something racist in your perceptions? And I genuinely, I don't think there is at all. And I think if Saudi have done amazing things, and as you said, the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight would have happened quickly when they were in their prime. And the atmosphere is getting slowly better. The first time I went to a fight in Saudi, it was kind of deathly quiet. The last two visits have been Fury Usyk, and the atmosphere have been okay. Nothing like it would be, before 80,000 people in London or Madison Square Gardens, or can you imagine a Croke Park if that could ever happen? What the atmosphere would be like. But I'm not so hung up on the atmosphere. I mean, I think that will come with time, because at the moment, I think most people in Saudi don't particularly follow boxing. They don't know much about it. They're not bothered about it. But maybe over time it would develop. But until the human rights issues are sorted out, I think I'll always be uncertain about endorsing Saudi's stranglehold on boxing.
Sure. I don't know whether, as somebody who has such a close affinity and experience with boxing, that you've sort of slowly watched the rest of big ticket sport sort of sink into the same sort of nefarious forces around them. I mean, there's a case here to be made that boxing is simply a trailblazer to all of this, that now, even within the biggest sports in the world, you have not only agencies that are trying to sports wash, but also deeply corrupt governing bodies which overarch it and are connected to governments as well. So I suppose, are we being unfair on boxing here in saying that the business around it is so dark that it somehow separates it from any other sport?
Yeah, I was kind of amused, the sports washing angle. Why would you go to boxing to cleanse your image? But yeah, boxing was the first to start doing this. And yeah, I think certainly when I write about other subjects for The Guardian, I also highlight the way, say, football, for example, has just, totally endorsing Saudi, with the World Cup coming and Infantino and, what he says and does. So yeah, boxing certainly is not the sole guilty party. All sports seem to be, happy to take the Saudi cash.
Just on Usyk, a very interesting character, given all that's going on in the world. But there's a lot of people speaking after his last fight about his kind of place on the pantheon amongst heavyweights. I know comparing eras, is not an exact science, but where do you see him? Because he seems to be pretty awesome.
He certainly is. I'm a bit different to a lot of boxing fans in the sense that I'll sort of look at Usyk in a wider sphere. And I think, since Muhammad Ali, I personally don't think there's been a heavyweight champion who has had the political resonance that Usyk has. Certainly, you can't compare him to Ali and what Ali did for civil rights. But in terms of Ukraine and the conflict with Russia, Usyk is a giant figure. So I think that's important to say at the outset. In boxing terms, he keeps on shocking me. He's fighting these monsters. Like Tyson is 6'9". Usyk's not a small man. He's 6'2", but he's fighting guys who weigh so much more than him or so much bigger than him. And he just has such a complex and sophisticated boxing brain that he can sort of work out how to outsmart these guys. It might take him 6, 7, 8, 9 rounds, but he always finds a way. And in that pub game where you're saying, oh, how would Usyk do against, Mike Tyson or against Muhammad Ali? It's kind of meaningless, but it's fun. I think latter years of Mike Tyson, Usyk would definitely have beaten him. He would have found a way. But when Mike Tyson was at his most savage best in his early 20s, I think even Usyk wouldn't have been able to withstand that storm.
Yeah, is there any part of you that sort of is sad for the situation that Mike Tyson finds himself in now, as somebody who saw him in his very best? I think we'll always remember Tyson, the fighter. When people say Mike Tyson, he was so brilliant that we recall that. But having to witness everything else that has happened since then has been a bit of a shame, really.
It has. Look, we also should say Tyson's done some despicable things to people and justifiably has been to jail for some of his crimes. But, I also have a complicated history with Mike Tyson, but I like him when I'm with him. And, he's given me the best interviews I think I've ever done. But I was in Dallas, last summer when he fought Jake Paul, which was a circus stunt. Katie and Amanda Serrano were on the undercard. It was sad, but what I liked about Tyson, he actually said nothing. They were all hyping up. They had all these sort of slick US journalists being MCs and saying, Mike, where does this moment stand in your stellar career? He'd say nothing or nowhere, or he wouldn't answer the question. He'd say, I don't know, man. He just was so obviously there for the money. He wouldn't actually dignify it by attempting to big it up and saying, oh, this is a momentous moment in my career. He was there for the money. So I kind of liked the way he did that. But it was just sad. The fight, he was just so old. He tried so hard, but he's 58 years old. And Jake Paul obviously is a mediocre boxer, better than some people think, but still a novice in many ways. And he was slowly kind of beating up Mike Tyson. And yeah, that was sad to see. But I guess Mike would argue that he made so much money that it was worth kind of the indignity of it all.
Sure. Just you mentioned there about interviewing Mike Tyson before, and I mean it's a question that a lot of people ask, like why is so much of the best sports writing about boxing? And it does seem to be that there's a very unique sort of ecosystem there between interesting protagonists and particularly skilled journalists and access. Is that
Yes.
is like if you go back to the days of like Liebling and Norman Mailer, like
Yes.
is that what you find when you think about boxing writing?
I mean, those guys had access. I mentioned earlier about McElvany being able to just call up Muhammad Ali at home and going to see him that day and spending 6 hours just chatting. And Liebling Mailer, they had the same access. Those days obviously don't happen anymore, but certainly when I started out in the 1990s, it was possible to get quite close to someone like Mike Tyson on isolated days. And I think why writers love boxing is because the stories are like nothing else, not only in sport, but in life. Most of the top fighters, and KT would perhaps be an exception to this again, but most of the top fighters have come out of, such bleak lives, bleak past with absolutely no opportunity. And boxing gives them the opportunity to do something. So that combined with the fact that fighters face kind of existential moments when their lives are in the balance, they could die when they're fighting, they could be maimed. So there's an urgency to their talk, and also there's a candor to their observations. And when you ask someone like Mike Tyson, are you scared before a fight? He says, what do you think? And I say, well, I assume you are a little scared. He said, of course I'm scared. And it's not fear of being hurt, it's fear of being exposed. And you a Gaelic footballer or a Premier League footballer, you lose a game. Of course, it's disappointing. But if you're a fighter and you get beaten and beaten up and knocked out, it's humiliating. And these men and women, their whole identities feel like they crumble when they lose. So it lends such candor to their conversations, which is a privilege to hear.
Sure. But just to finally, Don,
Mm.
if you say this is your last book, have you figured out how you're going to fill the void? And I suppose where are you on boxing? Like, are you done, or are you one sort of charismatic prodigy away from throwing yourself in at the deep end again?
Well, firstly, I want to emphasize that this is not my last book. I'm going to be writing about many other subjects. I'm an old guy now,
Sure.
but I still my energy and curiosity about the world is as intense as ever. So I'm going to be writing books for as long as I live, I think. But I do think it's my last boxing book. And my sort of relationship with boxing, if I had to define it in one word, it would be dysfunctional. Boxing has done a lot of good for me. It enabled me to become a full-time writer. It's given me opportunities to meet incredible people, but it has also exposed me to the worst kind of darkness in life, whether that's death, criminality, doping, lying, corruption. It's all there in boxing. So I will continue to write about boxing for The Guardian. I'm going to become a journalist now, a proper one, I think. So the bad side for me means I've got to write more about doping and corruption, but I'm going to do it in journalistic form. I'm not going to allow myself to be seduced and spend 6 years writing a book where in many ways I'm justifying boxing as a business. But yeah, as you said, maybe next week there'll be some, oh God, I'm going to write a book about that person, and I'll do the classic cliche of making a comeback, but we'll see.
Well, the book is The Last Bell: Life, Death and Boxing, and it's outstanding. Don McRae, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Connor. I enjoyed talking to you.